My name is Michael Boughn, and I am the author of Cosmographia, a post-Lucretian faux micro-epic. Cosmographia is well, as it says, a post-Lucretian faux micro-epic, which is to say a kind of cross between an homage and a goof on the possibilities of the epic in the year 2010. The idea of the book is that every epic, you have a descent into the underworld and then a climb up out of that towards some other possibility. Call it heaven or whatever, right? Gloucester, Polis, So that was the basic, is a journey. You start at Troy and you end up back at Ithaca or whatever. I mean, those are all the names that people put to the pieces of the journey that the epic is recording. So I had that, and that was a kind of basic structure. And then there's the fact that certainly epics since, I don't know, not so much Homer. Homer doesn't so much comment on politics, but certainly Dante. I mean, the whole political world comes into the Commedia. Milton is all about the commenting on the politics of the day. So that's something that was of interest to me, to be able to write political poetry that was still poetry and somehow part of this larger structure. So that enters into the poetry. And geez, I don't know, it just kind of takes on a life of its own, One of the inspirations for this, as I mentioned before, was Flann O'Brien. I was reading Flann O'Brien's, I just read it, Swim Two Birds, and then I was reading The Third Policeman as our plane flew over Ezra Pound's grave and landed in Venice. And the idea just came to me to do these 12 books. And I actually started writing them in Tuscany. In terms of poetry, the question is, how do you write the world in a way that is not always somehow contained by the idea of self-expression or the self's limits? And that's what the attraction of the epic was to Olson. It was what it was to Pound. Certainly that's what it was to my friend Jack Clark, and that's what the seductive prospect was to me. Well, traditionally the epic is the option to the lyric, and I'm not really interested in lyric poetry. I also come out of a history of working with poets who have been involved in that idea one way or the other. Jack Clark, who was a student of Charles Olson, Robin Blazer, who was a very close friend of Charles Olson's. I was in Buffalo for a long time, and Olson's influence in Buffalo is huge. So the idea of the epic, it's kind of a challenge, right? Can you actually do it? What does it mean to do an epic now, after Olson? Lucretius was a Roman poet, a contemporary of, slightly older actually than Virgil. Same period though. In fact, I think he was like one of Virgil's models. Lucretius writes a book, De Rerum Natura, in which he describes the whole universe. There's the world, right? Now, it's not exactly scientific in the sense that we think of science, because we didn't have that institution then. But it's a combination of what they would call natural history and Epicureanism, Epicurean philosophy, and all of this sort of woven together in this marvelous texture of explanation to a student of his about what the world is and how he should be in it. So that moment, that Lucretian moment, is a moment that we lost to the self, because the self wants to constantly talk about how it feels and not about necessarily what it sees. Much of the poetry was written during the invasion of Iraq. And I have very strong feelings about that, as I'm sure you do, and most of us did. And but you can write really bad poetry coming out of strong feelings about the war. There's a lot of very bad poetry about the war. So this was a way for me to resituate that material in a context that gave it a larger frame and redefined it in some sense. I found myself in a circumstance where most of my time was taken up driving kids to karate lessons or piano lessons or cello lessons, or you name it. It was constant. And I had no time at home to write. So I developed this technique with 22 Skidoo where I would conceive of the book and write out all the titles. And then wherever I was, I could open my notebook and fill out a line here, a line there, skip around among the poems, which was really interesting to me because it actually opened up this whole other dimension of the writing, where poems start talking to each other back and forth in process at the beginning and the end and in the middle and all over the place. So you get these wild conversations between poems going on. So this book was a sort of much longer attempt to implement that possibility